Most people who come to Britain start off by visiting London. And why not? It's one of the most exciting cities in the world. But to come here and see only London is to miss a great deal. Britain offers the most varied experiences imaginable. Although it's steeped in history and tradition, it's full of surprises. And whatever your interests, rich with opportunities for you to make discoveries of your own. One of the things that people find fascinating about Britain is that we have a monarchy. Wherever you go, you see evidence of royalty in the names of pubs, streets, concert halls, and railway stations. You see their monograms on postboxes, their portraits on stamps, and their coats of arms on their favorite shops. If you want to catch a glimpse of the royal family while you're here, there are a number of state occasions when you can do so, like the ceremony of Trooping the Colour in June. You might be interested to learn that when the Queen is in residence at Buckingham Palace or at any of her other homes, her personal flag, the Royal Standard, is always flown above the building. You might also be interested to note the plaque on what is now an office building near Berkeley Square. This is where the Queen was born. Wherever you go, not just in London, you see statues of our kings and queens. Surprisingly, there's no statue in London of our most famous king, Henry VIII, though there is one in Cambridge. Henry is best known for the fact that he married 6 wives, 2 of whom, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, he had beheaded. In every way a man of excess, Henry VIII was renowned for the splendor of his palaces. His favorite was Hampton Court on the River Thames. In one of the courtyards, there's an astronomical clock, showing planetary movements as well as the time. In the archway beneath, you can see the initials H and A, Henry and Anne. It's interesting that though Henry had Anne Boleyn put to death, he never had the A removed. Henry's daughter, by Anne Boleyn, was Elizabeth I. Elizabeth was as strong-willed and ruthless as her father. As she proclaimed, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." As a young woman, Elizabeth was imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Tower, built by William the Conqueror, was for centuries the most dreaded of prisons and a place of execution. If you go to the Tower, you'll see 8 ravens strutting around, each jealously guarding its own territory. There have been ravens in the Tower for hundreds of years. Tradition has it that if they should ever leave, the monarchy would fall and the country would collapse into chaos. The monarchy did in fact fall in 1649, when following a civil war, King Charles I was deposed and beheaded. The monarchy was reinstated 11 years later, when his son Charles II was made king. Outside the Houses of Parliament, a Bible in one hand, a sword in the other, stands Oliver Cromwell, the man who overthrew Charles I. For 11 years, the Puritan Cromwell was head of state. He was never crowned king, however. nor was bonny Prince Charlie. In 1745, Charles Edward Stuart, a descendant of Charles I, rallied the Scottish clans around him in a bid to claim the throne. This event is always linked with the Isle of Skye, where the young pretender was rowed across the water by a woman called Flora MacDonald. His unsuccessful uprising is commemorated by a monument in Glenfinnan. At one time, the Scots had their own monarchs, who in the Middle Ages ruled from Edinburgh Castle. The castle, raised on a great volcanic rock, still towers over the city. Every day at 1 o'clock, a curious ceremony takes place here on the battlements, when, as a time signal, a field gun is fired. It's probably unrelated to the 1 o'clock gun, but if you look at the wall facing the castle, you'll see a cannonball lodged in it. There are literally hundreds of castles in England, Scotland and Wales, evidence of an unsettled and often bloody past. Some castles are still intact and are much as they would have been 500 or 600 years ago. Others, battle-scarred and siege-wrecked, survive only as romantic ruins. Possibly the best preserved of all the castles in Britain, and one still used by the royal family, is Windsor, a favourite home of Queen Victoria. Victoria, who came to the throne at the age of 17, reigned for 60 years. At one time, as head of the empire, she was sovereign to a third of the world's people. More than anyone in history, Queen Victoria came to epitomise the taste and spirit of the age in which she lived. Not known for a sense of humour, Victoria's most famous remark is the icy comment, "We are not amused." People are often struck by the great antiquity of what they find in Britain. Places like Silbury Hill and Stonehenge. Stonehenge is an enigma. Standing alone on Salisbury Plain, it's what remains of a Stone Age temple built 4,000 years ago. As old as the pyramids, Stonehenge was built with scientific precision, so that it would be in line with the first rays of sunrise on the longest day of the year. But how these enormous stones came to be put in place remains a mystery. According to 12th century chronicler Geoffrey of Monmouth, they originated in Africa. They were carried by giants from there to Ireland and then magically transported to Wiltshire by Merlin, the magician at the court of King Arthur. All over Britain you find relics of Stone Age man. In the great stone circles, of which Stonehenge is only one of many, and in the huge mounds, called Long Barrows, in which he buried his dead. In Wales and in Cornwall are what appear to be shelters made of slabs of rock. These too are the remains of burial chambers. The most remarkable of these, its massive capstone delicately balanced on 3 points, is at Pentre Ifan in Pembrokeshire. As at Stonehenge, you have an eerie feeling of being in the presence of a lost civilization. In the south of England is the Vale of the White Horse, where a series of huge white horses have been cut into the chalk of the hillsides. The most extraordinary of these hillside carvings, however, is the great giant at Cerne Abbas in Dorset. This huge, naked man is believed to have been a fertility god. Another sacred and mysterious site, this time a Christian one, is Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset. In the middle of the ruined abbey is a group of flagstones. These mark the spot where King Arthur and Queen Guinevere are believed to have been buried. Looking down on the abbey is a great hill surmounted by a ruined tower. This hill, known as Glastonbury Tor, has long been regarded as a magical place, one, like Stonehenge, associated with Merlin the magician. There's an ancient belief that hidden somewhere on the slopes of the Tor, there's the entrance to a secret labyrinth leading to the underworld and the center of the earth. As you travel through the counties of Britain, you pass through countryside which is constantly changing. And you begin to see how these landscapes, each with its own distinctive character, have been reflected in the work of our writers and artists. Go to Dorset, for example, and you find yourself in the Wessex of Thomas Hardy, the author of Tess of the D'Urbervilles and Far from the Madding Crowd. Hardy's dramatic and tragic stories are set among these hills and along this still unspoiled coastline. You can visit the cottage in which Hardy was born, and you can still see many of the places described in his books, like the church at Bear Regis, where his doomed heroine Tess saw the Turberville windows. You can trace the old manor house in which Tess spent her wedding night. Alongside the house runs a little river crossed by an ancient pack bridge. If you go there, you'll discover an interesting relic of the past, a notice threatening anyone caught damaging the bridge with deportation to the colonies. This law, it seems, is no longer in force. Very different from the rolling hills of Hardy's Wessex is the flat and open scenery of East Anglia. Here in Suffolk are the landscapes painted in the early 1800s by John Constable. These scenes, reproduced endlessly on greetings cards and calendars, have changed very little and can still be visited. Dedham Vale, Willie Lott's Cottage, and Flatford Mill. John Constable's Suffolk is one of the many interesting rural areas which can be visited in a day's coach ride from London. To get a fuller experience of the countryside, however, it might be worth hiring a car and spending a night or two in a country inn, or at one of the many farms and cottages which offer bed and breakfast. If you're prepared to travel further afield, you could discover the pleasures of Scotland, Wales, the West Country, and the north of England. You could go to the rugged North York Moors, for example. On the edge of the moors, there's another place of literary pilgrimage. This is the parsonage where the three Bronte sisters lived. Anne, Charlotte, the author of Jane Eyre, and Emily, who wrote the great romantic novel Wuthering Heights. High up on the moors are the Bronte Falls and the ruins of the old farm building believed to have been the model for Wuthering Heights. As you walk these hills, you can sense how the sisters drew their inspiration from this bleak, wild landscape. Travel further north towards the Scottish border and you pass through the hill country of Northumberland, crossing Hadrian's Wall, the 70-mile-long rampart built by the Romans to keep out the warlike Scots. As you pass into Scotland, the landscape changes again. Here you're in the country of Sir Walter Scott, author of Rob Roy and Ivanhoe. It was at Abbotsford House in Roxburghshire that Scott created the mock baronial castle that he made his home. Just a few miles away is Scott's View, a vantage point where you can see for miles across the patchwork wooded landscape. Go further north into the Highlands and you find yourself in some of the most beautiful scenery in Europe. Parts of Britain are surprisingly isolated, and unless you've got a car and a good map, very hard to reach. In some remote areas, such as the Highlands of Scotland, you can take a ride with the postman and travel with him on his delivery round. This may not be the speediest way of getting about, but it gives you a good opportunity to meet local people. Somewhere else where you can take advantage of the post bus is the Lake District. At Dove Cottage in Grasmere lived the poet William Wordsworth and his sister Dorothy. In his youth, Wordsworth loved to explore this mountainous landscape, and his poems give vivid accounts of its impact upon him. For many people, the Lake District is first and foremost Wordsworth country. But he wasn't the only writer to live here. On the other side of Lake Windermere, at Hilltop Farm, lived Beatrix Potter, creator of Jemima Puddle Duck, Peter Rabbit, The Two Bad Mice, and the hapless frog, Jeremy Fisher. In the age of Queen Victoria, Britain led the world in industry and invention. The factories, cotton mills and streets of terraced houses shown in such detail in the paintings of L.S. Lowry are rapidly disappearing. But the landscape still bears quite triumphantly the features of the Industrial Revolution, like the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol. and the Forth Bridge just outside Edinburgh. The first iron bridge in the world was built in Shropshire at a place which for the past 200 years has borne the name Iron Bridge. A mile or so from the bridge is Blist's Hill, a living museum where you can see for yourself what life was like in an industrial town 100 years ago. There's a mine shaft and a foundry where the molten iron is poured by hand. The street here is made up of 19th century stores and workshops, where business is conducted very much as it would have been in Victorian times.
To the chemist and tell him, say, look, I've got a bad chest cough or I've got a bad tummy.
There's a pharmacy where traditional remedies are dispensed. There's a bank where you can exchange your money for Victorian coins at the appropriate rate of exchange.
And £1.20 for the silver threepence.
And a pub where you can buy pints of beer for a few Victorian pennies. If you're interested in how people used to live, you should visit the Welsh National Folk Museum near Cardiff. Among the many buildings here is a little row of miners' cottages which show you how people's lives and tastes have changed. The first house is as it would have been in about 1820. The other cottages are as they might have been lived in by later generations in the valleys. The Victorian age was the age of the railway. Although most of the railways have long since been electrified, there are still some privately owned steam services to be found, many of which have been kept open by enthusiastic volunteers. One of several in Wales is the Blaenau-Festiniog line, which runs through the mountains of Snowdonia. An extraordinary feature of this mountain railway is that some of its locomotives are double-ended, enabling them to push and pull in either direction, an apparently brilliant invention which never seems to have caught on. Originally used to carry slate from the quarries, this is the oldest working railway in the world. Another method of transporting goods in Victorian times was to use the canal system. Today, these waterways have virtually no commercial traffic, but much of the network remains, to be used by holidaymakers who soon learn to manage the narrow boats designed for these waters. Britain has waterways of all sorts, not just canals, but lakes, streams and rivers of all sizes. Its longest and most famous river, the Thames, is the main artery of southern England. Upstream, as it winds its way past Windsor Castle, the Thames is a clear, placid river greatly enjoyed by boat lovers. It is on the upper reaches of the Thames that in one of the great children's books, The Wind in the Willows, a mole, a water rat, a toad, and a badger become friends and have adventures together. Believe me, there's nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing about in boats. Each year, a great social event is held at Henley, a regatta which has been going since Victorian times. By the time the Thames passes through London, it has become a major thoroughfare. Until the 1950s, it was one of the great working rivers of the world, full of tugboats and barges and with hundreds of warehouses lining its banks. That phase of its history is over. Today, the warehouses have been converted into offices, apartments, shops, and restaurants. And the docks themselves have become a centre for water sports. Of the many bridges over the Thames, the most famous is Tower Bridge, designed to be opened in the middle to let shipping pass through. Although it looks ancient, this great symbol of London is barely 100 years old. It's a Victorian creation with complicated ironwork and machinery hidden beneath the stone facing. You can take a boat and go downstream to Greenwich, the birthplace of both Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. Greenwich is the home of the National Maritime Museum and the sailing ship, the Cutty Sark. In Greenwich Park is the Royal Observatory. This is where Greenwich Mean Time comes from, the standard by which all the world's time zones are set. Through the centre of the observatory runs the line that divides east and west. Looking down from it, you get a fine view of the Thames. Britain's two ancient universities, Oxford and Cambridge, were built on the banks of rivers, the Isis and the Cam. In both places, you can see people drifting along the river in punts, apparently quite effortlessly. But be warned, it's trickier than it looks, and unless you have a good sense of balance, it's easy to end up in the river. On the subject of boats and waterways, no account would be complete without mention of a lake, 24 miles long in the Highlands of Scotland. This, of course, is Loch Ness. Over the years, many people claim to have seen what appears to have been some kind of prehistoric monster in the dark waters of the loch, though their descriptions of it tend to vary rather greatly, from being covered with warts to being black and shiny with 4 humps. A Mr. George Spicer, who claimed to have seen the creature in 1933, described it as being fearful and an abomination. Some people claim to have taken photographs of the monster, but the evidence they provide is a bit questionable. The hunt for Nessie has become a worldwide obsession and a national joke. British have a great fondness for the fantastical and odd, as you can tell from the families of gnomes which can be found in gardens up and down the country. And when it comes to building, they're sometimes willfully eccentric. At Starhead in Wiltshire is an idealised landscape of the 18th century. Here, surrounding an artificially created lake, you can see a medieval cross, several grottos, an ivy-clad Gothic cottage, and no less than 3 classical temples. The British fondness for the architecture of ancient Greece and Imperial Rome led to a Victorian copy of the Parthenon being built in Edinburgh, and a version of the Roman Colosseum being erected in the Scottish town of Oban. One of the tallest classical columns in the world is the Monument in London. This was built to commemorate the Great Fire of 1666. Inside it, there's a spiral staircase of 311 steps, and you can climb right to the top, where there's a symbolic ball of flame and a little platform which gives one of the finest views in London. In Brighton, there's what looks like the palace of a Maharaja. This is the famous Pavilion, an Anglo-Indian fantasy built for Queen Victoria's uncle, the Prince Regent. Every bit as exotic and yet more curious, there's a house in Scotland shaped like a pineapple. In Dorset, there's a little thatched cottage shaped like an umbrella. In Suffolk, there's the House in the Clouds, built around a water tower. And in Barwick Park in Somerset, miles from anywhere, in the middle of a muddy field, there's a figure known, though no one knows why, as Jack the Treacle Eater. Perhaps the grandest, and certainly one of the most delightful of follies, is Castell Coch near Cardiff. This fairy tale castle, taken straight from the pages of medieval romance, was built not in the Middle Ages, but in Victorian times. The Great Hall of the castle is a piece of pure fantasy with an elaborate mural depicting the birds and animals of Aesop's fables. The man who built Castell Coch was reputed to be the richest man in Britain. But you don't have to be particularly wealthy to indulge your taste for the bizarre and extravagant. In Stowmarket, for example, is the home of Charlie Bird, a retired engineer whose garden boasts 60 plastic windmills, 9 model herons, 3 stag's heads, 426 garden gnomes, and a fast-breeding colony of plaster rabbits. The spirit of folly and fantasy is alive and well, it seems, and can be found in Stowmarket. The coastline of Britain is 6,000 miles long and, as you might expect, full of variety. ranging from the family coastal resorts of England and Wales to the mountainous sea lochs of Scotland. The coastal waters are fascinating for bird watchers and people interested in wildlife. Off the coast of Northumberland, you can take a small boat to the Farne Islands. These waters are a breeding ground for the rare grey seal. The Farne Islands are also home to great flocks of seabirds, puffins, kittiwakes, and guillemots, which can be seen fluttering in their thousands. On the Dorset coast, there is the swannery at Abbotsbury. This is the largest colony of swans in the world. It was founded 600 years ago when these birds were reared to be eaten. Incidentally, as a result of a law passed by King Henry VIII, who clearly enjoyed feasting on their meat, nearly all swans in Britain remain the personal property of the monarch. A little way along the coast from Abbotsbury is Lyme Regis, a small seaside town famous for the fossils found in its cliffs. It's also renowned for having been used as the setting for the film The French Lieutenant's Woman. On the coast of Suffolk is the isolated marshland where the composer Benjamin Britten chose to make his home. There, near Aldborough, he founded the Maltings Concert Hall. This old timber building, overlooked by Henry Moore sculptures, is now the site of an international music festival. Back in Northumberland, close to the Farne Islands, is Holy Island. Holy Island, also known as Lindisfarne, is a wonderfully isolated spot with a castle perched high on the rocks and the ruins of a medieval priory. The island is joined to the mainland by a causeway which you can drive over when the tide is low. You have to be sure to get back before high tide, however, or you'll find yourself in difficulties. Britain is full of churches, from the great cathedrals of the county towns to the smallest of parish churches. The church, which for centuries has been at the centre of village life, is often a treasure house of history and tradition, with its parish records, its bells, its stained glass windows, and the memorial brasses set in its flagstones. In some churches, you're allowed to make rubbings of the brasses and copy for yourself the features of some long-dead lord or lady. In many old churches, however, the brasses were destroyed by Oliver Cromwell's men during the English Civil War. There's a church in Suffolk, for example, where the Roundheads stationed their troops. The indentations in the stone are the surviving evidence of a floor which must once have been covered in brasses. The soldiers stabled their horses here in the church, tethering them to the pillars. It's said that they even went so far as to use the carved angels in the vaulting for target practice. Graveyards, like churches, can be full of historical interest. most famous in Britain probably is Highgate Cemetery in North London. Crammed with the most extravagant tombs, this is the resting place of many eminent Victorians. Duddingston Kirk in Edinburgh has a graveyard with particularly macabre associations. This was the haunt of Burke and Hare, the Edinburgh body snatchers. To avoid bodies being dug up and used for medical research, the parishioners built a watchtower to make sure that no one interfered with the graves. As an extra precaution, some graves were walled round and covered with an iron grid to keep the body snatchers at bay. A church with strong literary associations is Holy Trinity at Stratford-upon-Avon. This is the burial place of William Shakespeare. He too seems to have been worried by the thought that his body might be dug up. The verse on his tomb bears a curious threat. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." If you go to Westminster Abbey, you'll see another statue of Shakespeare. You'll also see memorials to many of Britain's most famous writers. This part of the Abbey is known as Poets' Corner. Here you'll see the grave of Thomas Hardy. Yet if you go to Dorset, you'll see in the churchyard near his cottage a tomb with his name on it. If you look carefully, however, you'll see that what's interred here is only Hardy's heart, which was buried separately from the rest of his body in his beloved Wessex. Which brings us to our ghost story. In the 1600s, there was a man in Somerset called Theophilus Brome, who, for reasons of his own, requested that whilst his body should be buried in the village churchyard, his head should be cut off and placed in a cupboard in the adjoining farmhouse. Over the years, a number of attempts have been made to reunite the head with the body, but on each occasion something sinister has occurred and the head has never been buried. Now, a toothless skull, it remains in its cupboard, where it looks as though it will stay. When people come to Britain, they usually want to visit the great houses, the so-called stately homes, many of which are open to the public. If you go to Yorkshire, for example, you can visit Castle Howard, which you might recognize from the television serial Brideshead Revisited. If you're in Wiltshire, you might like to visit Longleat, the home of the Marquis of Bath. Longleat, one of the finest houses in Britain, was built in the 16th century on an estate which in 1540 was purchased for only £53, the price today of a pair of shoes. A fine moated house in Kent is Hever Castle. This was the childhood home of Henry VIII's second wife, the unfortunate Anne Boleyn. Hever has a remarkable sculpture garden. Like Hampton Court, Hever has a very complicated maze. Another house with a formal garden is at Athelhampton in Dorset. Athelhampton House is a classic English country mansion. Not only does it have a secret passage, it's also reputed to have at least 3 ghosts. There's the ghost of an 18th century swordsman killed while dueling in the Great Hall. He can be seen, they say, sword in hand in the dark passageways of the house. There's also the ghost of the mysterious Grey Lady, who it is said threw herself from an upper window and still haunts the bedrooms. The third ghost is that of her pet monkey, who met his end as a result of being accidentally locked in the secret passage. The poor monkey, staring at its reflection in a looking glass, is now remembered in the family crest. If you're interested in seeking out the homes of some of the famous people who have lived in London, you should keep your eyes open for the plaques which you can see on the walls of more than 300 houses. Charles Dickens lived in Bloomsbury, not far from the British Museum, in a house which you can visit. You can also track down many of the locations in his novels: the Old Curiosity Shop, the site of the Marshalsea Prison, and the George and Vulture Inn, where the Pickwick Club held their meetings. Some of these Dickensian sites are outside London, of course. Places like Bath, where the Pickwick Club stayed during the course of their travels around the West Country. Bath was once one of the most fashionable cities in Europe. It got its rather unusual name from the fact that it was founded on the site of a Roman bath built 2,000 years ago over a naturally warm spring. You can still visit the Roman baths, though unlike the dandies of the 18th century, you aren't allowed to bathe in the water, which curiously they seem to do fully dressed, complete with their powdered wigs. Back in Kent is Chartwell, the home of Sir Winston Churchill. It was here, when he could get away from affairs of state, that he liked to paint, in his studio in the grounds of the house. In Larne, in South Wales, is a boatman's cottage overlooking the estuary of the River Taff. This was the home of the poet Dylan Thomas. A short way from the house is a little shed. It was here, surrounded by pictures of his favourite writers, that he wrote his best-known work, the play Under Milk Wood. Another writer lived at this house in the London suburb of Norwood, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was a fictional character, but the British find it hard to admit the fact. At St. Bartholomew's Hospital, there's a plaque marking the spot on which Holmes first met his friend, Dr. Watson. If you go in search of the famous 221B Baker Street, where Holmes is supposed to have had his rooms, you may be disappointed to discover that there is now an office building there. Look a little further, however, and you'll be in for an agreeable surprise, for just a few yards away is the Sherlock Holmes Museum. Ring the bell and you'll be admitted to Holmes's rooms, exactly as described in the stories. With his chemistry apparatus, his violin, his pipe, and his permanently cluttered desk. The pursuit of pleasure is a hard thing to define. While some people might go into raptures about going in search of Sherlock Holmes or photographing stone circles, others would far rather stretch out on a beach or spend the morning shopping. If you're keen on the arts, there'll always be plenty to do. Britain probably has more theatres, for example, per head of the population than any country in the world. Britain also has some of the world's great art galleries. Among the thousands of galleries and museums to be visited are some which contain very unusual collections, like the Museum of Dentistry, Museum of Teddy Bears, and the Museum of Advertising and Packaging. Scotland's Museum of Childhood is halfway up the Royal Mile in Edinburgh. A high point in the cultural calendar of that city is the Edinburgh Festival, which runs for 3 weeks in August.
Now Edinburgh too has a fine distinction. Edinburgh too gets a nice abuse. Everybody knows when the east wind up and blows, Edinburgh tunes are reduced. The two conditions that could be described as the Alton Shuffle and the Newtown Stride. So cast a canny eye on the Soothside swagger, don't be taken in by the Newtown taste. Edinburgh tune wears a wig above a goon, beneath above a bib and lace. Now there's no mistaken Jekyll for Hyde of the Alton Shuffle or the Newtown Stride.
Leaving culture to one side, Britain also has plenty to offer the sports enthusiast. It was, after all, the birthplace of golf and of tennis. It was the home, if not of football, at least of that distinctively British form of it known as rugby, invented at Rugby School in 1823 when one of the boys decided to break the rules. And it was Britain that gave the world cricket. Cricket is a game which visitors often seem to find baffling, and one of the few in which the action is suspended midway for everyone to have tea. On the subject of tea, if you should find yourself in Bath, an unmissable experience is to visit the Pump Room, where you can enjoy afternoon tea and a free concert. Britain doesn't exactly have a worldwide reputation for its cuisine, but three things for which it is justly renowned are afternoon tea, a national dish of fish and chips, and the substantial British breakfast of bacon, eggs, sausages, and tomatoes. Another great British institution is the pub. Apart from the pleasure of developing a taste for British ale, served from the pump in pint glasses and at room temperature rather than chilled, the pub is a great place to meet local characters.
Not bad. Oh, that man. Aye. Have a taste, have a taste.
Some pubs have interesting stories attached. There's the Mayflower, for example, a Thames-side pub from whose steps the Pilgrim Fathers are believed to have set sail. The Globe Inn in Dumfries, frequented by Robbie Burns, and the Royal Standard of England in Buckinghamshire, where King Charles I, fleeing from the Roundheads, once took shelter. This is believed to be the oldest pub in Britain. The smallest pub is the Old Blacksmith's Arms in Dorset, or so the locals would have you believe. In Bury St Edmunds near Cambridge, there's a pub called the Nutshell, which measures only 7 feet by 15. You can decide for yourself which is the smaller. They're both worth a visit. As is that most characteristically British creation, the Seaside Pier. Pubs, shops, restaurants, museums, castles, the coast, seeing the country for yourself, just touring around and making your own discoveries.